this time he's Director of Strategic Programs at Cox. Sanjay Naik, you've met already. You know me very well, so let's get started. The topic of the panel today, right now, is the commercial opportunities opened up by SDX. And I think Sanjay has already kind of hinted at that possibility. And the question when we talk about commercial opportunity is, just to set the context, commercial opportunities for whom? And what we are talking about here is commercial opportunities for the carrier itself. What new commercial opportunities are opened up for a carrier when they adopt software-based solutions. And the challenge from an enterprise customer's perspective, which Sanjay you already pointed out, is that the enterprise customer is looking for a pay-as-you-go model, a flexible model where they can get storage, network, compute, all of them as and when they need it, depending on their workloads and application needs. However, the network, even though we've made advances in storage and compute, and maybe even the network inside the data center, network in the WAN and the network, insofar as the operator is concerned, is still a bottleneck, is still a challenge, and we're trying to get around that. And so the main thing we have to, when we talk about commercial opportunities, are okay, what are the things that are changing in the business models and in the way the operator is thinking about incorporating these SDX solutions so that they can actually make use of them to offer maybe a new service, to speed up certain kinds of infrastructure, set up tasks and so forth. So let's talk about, maybe we start at the business model level. What kind of maybe new business models are emerging for the consumption of services that are enabled because of operators going towards software-defined solutions. So are there some new business consumption models being enabled by that process, and if so, what are they? What are your opinions on that? Jeff and Sanjay.
Would you like to go first? Gladly. So just going to kind of comment on, enjoyed Sanjay's presentation a few minutes ago. And as we are looking at this holistically, recognize there's a number of points that we like to make as we're working through it. And first and foremost is that we've got to stop putting everything in custom silicon, as we've been doing for many years. And that's driven us into these very vertical kind of solutions. That there are better ways of doing it through x86 type silicon. And it doesn't have to be x86. It could be ARM. It could be whatever you happen to use. That's a different discussion altogether. But the less, in things that are at line rate, we use that custom silicon for that. Things that aren't at line rate, we don't do any custom silicon. And all these kind of points become very important as we go forward. Second point is that the things that we can virtualize them. And the reasons is why we're all sitting in this slightly warm room today, having these discussions, and we'll be here for the next 3 days, is that we've all recognized as the first penguins in this space. And the reason, for those that don't know the history of the first penguin, is that when the penguins are in the water, only one will jump up on land. The rest don't jump up until that first penguin comes back, because he's the one that's taking the risk, and y'all are the risk takers. And so it's great to see this many people here in this space. But by going to the virtualization, we recognize that we can now scale horizontally, which creates a whole world of complexities to us. So we all recognize this, and these are very important discussions for us to have, particularly in light of some of the discussions I heard this morning. The third point, directly to Vishal's points as we were talking through this with SDX, is that if you do not involve the BSS OSS layer from the start, you are doomed to repeat history. Because the most complex thing we as operators can do, speaking for Cox, not for PACNet, is to try to change our BSS OSS layer. It's very complex. That is how we interact with our customers. That is how we make our money. So that is a very long, slow process to get that to happen. But if you do not start with that, then you're going to have a very rough road as you go forward. So all of these technologies play into this. So sort of like my 3 rules of, as we talk about virtualization. So on to the actual point, since I kind of laid that groundwork, is that I very much enjoyed the 0 to 45 days, and we have the IRR that we have to meet as we roll out new services. The more quickly we can get the service rolled out, the more quickly we start hitting our IRR models, and the more rapidly that we actually turn it into a profitable business. When you have to fight through sort of my 3 points that I was riffing on, that it delays that inevitability of when we actually turn it over into a profit center. So whether we keep it internally, whether we push some of the services out to the customer, there should be nothing in this ecosystem that forces us one way or the other, because each one has a different need. If we design the applications such that we can take pieces of it and push it down to the customer for security reasons, for whatever we're doing, if it's video transcoding, content delivering networks, whatever we're doing, we're not binding ourselves into something where we've got to go out and roll a truck, or we have to re-engineer an application, take advantage of the APIs, etc. So I'm not going to get into the specific applications because those are too numerous to even really mention. But making the point that we have to think through the design, we have to change the way we do things, we've got to stop building everything into custom silicon at a high cost, which vendors love. Our investors don't quite feel the same way, because we can only re-engineer our network so many times.
Sanjay?
And I can probably add to that. I agree with everything that Jeff basically outlined. And when we started this process, it had to start with the OSS, BSS, right? And building the appropriate hooks. You can't disrupt a platform that's already working and is generating revenue for the business as well as supporting customers. But once we started the process of the BSS, OSS, and building the hooks and the enterprise service buses that spoke to all the different systems, that's when we started seeing that we were able to rapidly increase that. The biggest challenge we had, though, was more about internal culture, right? And people are used to doing work in a certain way, and these kind of platforms bring significant amount of disruption internally. That was one of the big challenges that we had to work through. To address your question there, Vishal, is more about the new business models, the new commercial opportunities. Our conversations with our customers have changed quite significantly, right? A typical telecom service provider, I can speak more of an experience in Asia Pacific because that's kind of where I lived before moving here. Every traditional telecom service is facing significant amount of price erosion, is facing significant amount of churn from our customers, right? And the only way that we felt as an organization that we could change and try and actually drive a positive growth trend through the business is to adopt something innovative as SDN, is to change the game by getting on with that program and being able to give customers that flexibility that they're looking for in terms of driving revenue. That's kind of has changed the conversation with our customers. We talk more about applications now with our customers as opposed to talking about designing the different types of networks. We have those discussions as well. You've got to have those discussions. A lot of customers, still like the benefits of an SDN, powered network, but they're not ready either to accept it. So we have those situations where they love the idea, they call us in, they talk about it, but then go and buy a traditional networking environment and give us payment 45 days later. But hey, what can you do, right? So it's a very evolving environment. It's completely revolutionary. It's impacting all of the different people that touch it at some point, but it's definitely creating a lot of opportunity for us.
So what I heard from both you and Jeff was there are 3 things that are changing. You move away from custom silicon, involve the OSS, BSS right from the get-go, and thinking about not just the network but the business models itself, because unless you can enable new things, without the OSS you really can't do that. And then scale horizontally. And then as a result of that, it seems that the conversations with your customers are changing. They are moving up the stack, would you say, and more focused on application, or maybe there's a spectrum. There are customers who are still thinking about the network in the old school days, and there are those that are thinking about applications. So the entire spectrum of business models is available. I mean, you might still be selling services on that 45-day cycle, or you might be selling some to some very advanced customers that are, looking at turning up services, incrementally, dynamically, and so on.
Look, exactly. I think, where we see ourselves at this point in time is, SDN into the network is probably at that same place where infrastructure as a service was a few years ago, where customers still did not trust it enough. We're using it for, I'll do a little bit of software development on it. So similarly, they would say I would use maybe, the SDN platform for a backup network requirement, or maybe my software development environments, and then try and test it out a little bit. So that's kind of the phase we're in right now.
Yeah, and there's a stratification to our customers. That previously we were dealing with customers that were looking for this maybe end-to-end type service. And whether we were selling directly to a chain of hospitals, businesses, whatever they were, they wanted the ability to connect to point A to point B, and they didn't really care how that was done as long as the SLA was met. Now they're starting to run applications on top of it, and they're either running in their cloud, they may want to run them in our cloud, but it's truly changing, and they're being driven by the challenges of their competition. So the better we re-engineer our networks and provide the ability for the customer to be faster and to use the DevOps kinds of models, where they can get things done more quickly, the more challenge they can provide to, or put in place to their competition, and it puts us in a better place with our competition.
Excellent. So actually that segues beautifully into what I was going to go into next.
Yeah, I'm sitting here reading your notes.
You mentioned architecture, and the next question I had is, what are some of the architectural, we are going to focus a little bit on the software-defined data center, because that's the first place where all of this really gets started, although I know that the network is a bottleneck. And if we focus for a moment on the SDCC, what are the architectural approaches to SDCC design and service consumption that are influencing business models? How are you as operators thinking about SDCC design, and how you're going to parcel out that SDCC in a way that will enable these new business models and new conversations with your customers?
Okay. So, look, it really depends. It depends on the type of conversations that you're having with your customers. It depends on where some of these customers are in their own life cycle, from a business perspective, from a go-to-market perspective. You talk to some of the companies that are beyond a startup environment, are at a mid life cycle of their journey. You'll find that as it relates to software-defined data center network environments, the conversation is quite different to someone who's an established multi-billion-dollar organization out there. So it really depends on the type of organization that you're talking to. I think there are certain aspects of the infrastructure stack that we would do really well compared to any of these guys trying to be able to do it themselves. But there's a significant amount of influence that they have started putting into our business in terms of saying, I want the network to behave in a certain manner. I want traffic to be routed in a certain manner and have certain characteristics, because a 2 millisecond delay on my application means X $100,000 lost in terms of revenue. So again, the reason they're able to measure that is because in their own platform they've got software that is running analytics. They've got big data applications that's kind of driving that, and is forcing us as telecom providers to kind of analyze some of that internally and be able to respond through that through SDDC.
Yeah, and as we're looking at transforming our data centers, and there's a collapsing going on just in the industry in general. That looking at where we were 15 years ago, where we had 28 data centers, today we have 4. So as we've collapsed them, we've packed more and more capabilities into it. Now there's sub-data centers. But the primary work is being done inside these 4, I won't call them mega centers, but from the south we'd call them big old centers. But what we've done is we've put more capabilities into these data centers. So the communication between them, and multi-layer alone is a panel, I think, unto itself. Because we tend to think of a lot of this in the layers where we're talking about layers 4 through 7. Then we're talking about layers 3, 2, and 1. So things that we're doing in the application layer is really abstracted out away from the virtualization layers. There should be very little awareness, at least as I think through it. We have to start being aware of virtualization once we get to layer 3, and how we deal with high-speed transition with packets within not only a data center, but across the cloud entity within that data center. But then we have to get down to layer 0, where we have to actually have multi-layer optimizations, because you can't optimize at 0 without awareness of 3. You can't really, you can optimize at 3 without awareness of 0, but we're now, just now, starting to look at layer 0 optimizations. So whether you're thinking about it from the perspective of a network, or even within a data center, or across data centers, we're now starting to educate our own people. And there's been a lot of confusion when people think about the cloud. When they talk about virtualization, it's not the days of just running something in a VMware instance. It's much more complex than that. Because a cloud unto itself, you have to include resilience, reliability, availability. If you're not missing those 3 capabilities, you're not really doing cloud computing. We're not really optimizing data within a data center, or data center to data center communication. So trying to build that in up front, having that level of awareness requires, this high level of orchestration, this high level of application awareness, networking awareness at layer 3, and physical layer awareness at layer 0. So it really does require those to be thought through up front, because we just can't keep rebuilding the data centers. If we are going to try to expand back out, that's going to be a very difficult decision or discussion to have with our senior executives, considering we just reduced data centers.
So that's interesting, but I guess the next question is, customers don't have a lot of choices in the kind of cloud that they want to choose. And are you finding that, your approaches and models have to change, or at least incorporate the need of customers that might want private clouds that are sort of hosted with you? They might want a mixture of private and public clouds, where they're handling it independently, or they might want to build a hybrid cloud where either control is with the customer or with you as the operator. And how is that playing out, as this evolves?
Yeah, we're approaching all 3 scenarios. So we have those smaller operators or customers, MNOs, that we may be working with, who want to host things in our cloud, and we white label it. So we're just now starting to stand these kinds of instances up. There's the customers that want to host everything in their data centers, and we're still kind of struggling with that, figuring out it puts a new complexity into the network, because now we can no longer just do BGP. We have to do things like BGP-LS. OSPF is not going to cut it anymore. We really have to change the way this works and the way we get link state into the SDN controllers, which when we were starting to work through SDN, we didn't even think of that. So now we have to kind of run to catch up with what the customer requirements are. Hybrid model is even more complex. It's another layer of complexity on top of it. So where we've got to have pieces running in their cloud, pieces in our cloud. Quite honestly, we're still noodling through that. We're not at a point where I think we could even begin to have that as an offering. Hopefully, we're shooting for late 15, early 16 to actually do some testing on that. But to me, that's another layer of complication.
Sanjay, what about you? I know PACnet is doing data center interconnects and so on. So
right.
What's your thought on this?
Yeah, I think, look, our environment is a little bit different, because I think geography and the regulatory environments played a significant role for us. So, being a very Asian, focused organization, when we refined our overall network and data center solutions, we had a network of about 19 data centers in Asia Pacific that we offered customers the ability to come and co-locate and everything else. Of those, we had maybe about 11 that were really core to us, in terms of having the available capacity for customers to grow significantly. So when we thought about, you think about Asia, it's different geographies, it's different languages, different time zones, different currencies, completely different regulatory environments, monetary controls are different. When you take all of that complexity and you try to say, okay, I want to do a software-defined, networking environment across this geography with all of its disparity, it actually became quite a significant challenge. But that's where the opportunity was. Because if we could take, that complex an environment, the fact that we own the data center and then the fact that we own the underlying subsea capacity, were the only two reasons why we could actually do this. So I think it's a lot to do with, the kind of background that you have, the kind of ownership structures you have, and then the willingness to kind of go down this path and actually develop it.
Great. So let me open it up to the audience at this point. There are a few more things that we would want to walk through, but I'm sure there are people who had questions on your presentation and have thoughts on what we're discussing here. So why don't we take some audience questions? There's one at the back right there, and I think there's one on this side as well.
Hello, my name is.
Oops.
Hello, my name is Dominic Jodin from Noviflow. One of the ways carriers of tomorrow, call it like this, will compete is how you handle cybersecurity, which is becoming an enormous problem. And I'd like to hear if you have any experience of using SDN for cybersecurity, or what your thoughts are on that topic.
Mine's going to be a really short answer as it relates to, very specific, DDoS kind of environments impacting networks. Unfortunately, we haven't focused too much of our efforts on that, so we haven't really explored SDN, to be used for those kind of programs. But I do see an application for it, right? There are two ways to, I think, really handle a DDoS attack as it hits the service provider network. One is you throw more bandwidth at it, and the second one is you actually work with a managed service provider, to try and detect and mitigate those DDoS attacks, right? At its most basic case, for us, when we haven't thought about SDN and DDoS, we have thought about DDoS on the traditional networks. Our immediate answer or reaction would be to throw more bandwidth at it, and SDN allows us to do that.
So at least to that extent it helps, because you can do it quicker and faster, at least, and react a little bit better than you would normally.
I think so, yes, you're right.
So I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head for one of the things that we usually don't think about. So there are two things that, as we have historically as an industry, and I think after 35 years of being in this kind of space, get a little bit of historical vision here. One is security. That's one of the last things we typically think of. Another one is training and making sure people are aware and have an understanding of what we're doing. And we just historically just really stink at doing this. So one of the things we did with SDN was actually we started with our security group. And well, it sounds like a really good idea. Let me finish. So it wasn't until recently that they really kind of glommed onto it and understood what this really meant. Because their mindset as very good security folks was that they were used to seeing physical appliances. They were used, to server huggers to the max, that had to have this thing that they could wrap their arms around and touch and stroke it and do keystroke thingies that security people do. And that's the way they saw the world. When you start putting this into the virtual space, into the cloud, it really changes the way you have to view it. And it's taken us, probably a year. And it was only 2 weeks ago that, we're sitting in a meeting and literally I'm talking to some of the security folks, one of my peers, and I could see the light bulb go off above her head. And she was like, oh, so there really isn't a machine. And she got it at that point. So we have, fortunately, in the vendors we've been working with, we've been building these kinds of walled gardens around virtual machines. Still got a long way to go. Now we're starting to talk about how do we protect virtual networks, VXLANs, whatever you're doing. It still has a long way to go. There's a lot of smart folks in this room. I'm sure there's going to be some smart folks over in the demo room next door that are going to have some really nifty gadgets. But it still is a long way to go. So from all the years of physical security, where we went from the days of locking everything in a room to opening it up and doing walled gardens and firewalls and all kinds of gadgets. So it's moving. We're getting closer. We're not quite there. The first thing we chose to do when we demoed it to our executives was start with the security application. And building in DDoS, as Sanjay said, was key, using virtual DDoS detection, which was basically just taking what we were doing already, but just running it inside a VM. To taking anti-phishing, I call them the ants, anti-phishing, anti-spam, anti-malware, anti-whatever, and having those done in software, where we could actually, through service function chaining, which really wasn't service function chaining, but we were directing the traffic through these, both outbound and inbound, as we were running the demos, which uncovered a whole new series of interesting problems. But starting with that up front, making that the business case, because when you can reduce the dilemmas that you're going to have down the road with security and start out with that in mind, you get people's awareness. Now starting to work with people about how do you protect VMs in a multi-tenant environment. This is